The buzz from the overhead lights in the laundry had started to get under Lynn's skin, though she couldn't say why it suddenly felt louder than usual. Maybe it was the stillness of everything else, the machines tumbling in slow rhythm, the occasional scrape of a hanger on metal, the tired quiet of a Friday that seemed stretched too thin. At home, the silence wasn't much better. Dean sat in his recliner like always, eyes on the muted TV, his presence filling the room without offering anything back. The freeway groaned in the background, constant and indifferent. Riley, back from the army and trying to make sense of civilian life, had taken it upon himself to fix the broken hallway lamp. Lynn passed him as he adjusted the socket, and something in his glance caught her off guard. Not just politeness, not just curiosity, but a quiet kind of seeing that made her feel suddenly visible. She wiped her hands on her apron without thinking. And then, like he'd been holding it in all day, he asked, "You ever been really happy?" The words didn't push, didn't demand. They just settled in the air, unanswered. And for some reason, she didn't want to break the silence. At the dry cleaners, Lynn stood behind the register, trying to recall whether she'd handed the woman her change, but the customer was already gone, and the register drawer sat open like it was waiting to remind her she'd slipped. That kind of thing didn't usually happen. She prided herself on remembering the little steps. Later, in the garage, Riley surprised her by dragging out the old wooden dresser she'd been meaning to get rid of for years, not asking, not making a show of it, just doing. She watched from the doorway, unsure whether to thank him or pretend. She hadn't noticed. Instead, she made tea without thinking and brought it out, placing the cup on the workbench like it belonged there. After a moment, she asked, "What's it like, coming back and seeing everything different from how you remembered?" He looked at her for a beat, then said, "You're the only one who's asked." That answer hung heavier than it should have, but neither of them tried to make it lighter. At the market, the noise of weekend chatter and clinking produce bins blurred into the background as Lynn reached for a jar of mustard and heard someone say her name with a kind of half-laugh. She turned to see Jen, someone she hadn't thought about in years, standing there with a cart full of nothing in particular and a look that was both surprised and unsurprised. They talked for a few minutes, awkward at first, then easier, and, just as Lynn was about to leave, Jen said, "You were the bold one back then. You always knew what you wanted." The words clung to Lynn's clothes more than the scent of soap from work ever did. On the way home, she saw Riley sitting at the bus stop, his posture slumped in a way that said more than words could. She pulled up, rolled down the window, and didn't say much, just nodded. In the silence of the drive, he finally muttered, "You remind me of someone who used to believe in themselves." She didn't respond, just gave a half-smile that faded before they turned onto the freeway. In the garage, Riley crouched beside the old metal coffee pot she hadn't touched in years, carefully twisting a wire back into place while mumbling, something about how some things just need a little time and patience before you decide they're broken. Lynn, kneeling in the garden nearby, had pulled out a bag of potting soil on impulse that morning, her hands deep in the dirt, transplanting flowers she barely remembered buying. It wasn't a plan or a project. It was just something that felt better than standing still. As the sun began to dip and the air turned cooler, she brought out 2 chipped mugs, the scent of coffee filling the small porch between them. They sat without conversation, not because there was nothing to say, but because neither of them needed to fill the space. After a few minutes, Riley looked at her, not quite smiling, and said, "You look different, quieter somehow." She held the cup with both hands, nodded slowly, and replied, "Maybe just for today. Nothing's pressing down." What started as a quick errand turned into a detour when Riley suggested taking the back road, the one that curved past the old park with the rusting swings and faded benches. They ended up walking without much direction, the path leading them toward the creek where a narrow bridge crossed over. The wood creaked under their steps, and just as Lynn was glancing at the water below, her foot caught on a loose board, and she stumbled. Riley caught her instinctively, hands firm at her arms, and for a moment they stood still, too close and not moving away. She let out a quiet laugh, not because it was funny, but because the silence was starting to stretch too far. He didn't. Let go. The space between them shifted, tense, uncertain, and then he leaned in, barely, enough for her to feel it before it happened. The kiss was brief and strange, more surprise than intent. When they pulled apart, neither spoke right away. Then he said sorry. She shook her head, steady but soft, and answered, "Don't be, I just don't know what that was." They stopped speaking, not in any dramatic way, but in the quiet, avoidant kind that fills a house without ever slamming a door. Riley started, leaving early and coming back late, mentioning once that he'd signed up to volunteer at the local center for vets, then not bringing it up again. Lynn didn't ask. She moved through the house like someone trying not to wake a sleeping child, everything deliberate, measured. One night, Dean, out of nowhere, suggested going to that little steak place they used to like, the one with the sticky menus and good rolls. Over dinner, between sips of beer, he said he'd been thinking of selling the trailer, maybe heading south, someplace warmer, maybe quieter. Lynn didn't flinch, didn't argue, just nodded and smiled like he was talking about the weather. Later that night, Riley passed her in the hallway, barely meeting her eyes, but she caught the hesitation in his step. He saw it too. Something had shifted in her, something pulled in and locked away, and neither of them mentioned what they already knew. The backyard was quiet, except for the low hum of insects and the occasional shuffle of Riley's boots against the dry grass as he sat alone on the steps, arms resting on his knees, eyes somewhere out past the fence. Lynn came out with 2 cups of tea, not asking if he wanted one, just placing it beside him like an old habit she didn't remember starting. They sat there for a while without speaking, the air thick with whatever they weren't saying. After a long stretch of silence, he said, "You know, it's strange how being useful to strangers feels easier than being seen by the people you actually care about." She didn't respond right away, just looked at him, really looked, and saw how tired he was. Not just physically, but in the way people get when they've been carrying something for too long without setting it down. Finally, he added, "I always knew I'd leave again. I just didn't think it'd feel like this." Lynn didn't say anything. She only looked at his hands, calloused and still, and let the silence speak for her. The evening Riley left was like the last few days, quiet, almost too quiet, until the sound of his truck rumbling down the gravel driveway broke it. Lynn stood, by the window, watching him, feeling the weight of everything she hadn't said but knew was there. He didn't look back as he drove away, but she knew he was leaving in a way that said more than just a change of address. The note he left was brief, too brief for what it meant, stating only, "You deserve more than I could ever give." It didn't feel like a goodbye, not exactly, but it felt like something that had been coming for a while. Lynn folded the bow paper and set it on the counter, not knowing whether to be angry, sad, or just resigned. Dean, as if on cue, asked from the doorway, "Is this because of you?" She didn't answer right away. The question wasn't for her, it was for him, for them both. But all she said was, "No. It's because of us." Then, for the first time in weeks, she felt the weight of her own solitude press in, deeper than she could explain. Lynn arrived, home that afternoon to the strange emptiness of a house that once felt full. The air was heavy with quiet, the kind that fills every corner and presses down on your chest until you feel it in your bones. The job she'd been holding onto for years was gone. The new owners had decided to cut costs, and her position was one of the first to go. As if she didn't already feel invisible. The news hadn't hit as hard as it should have. Maybe because it felt like just another thing being pulled out from under her, like she'd been waiting for it. She put her purse down, walked through the house without really seeing anything, until she reached the kitchen. There, on the table, was a photo of Riley she hadn't even realized was missing. It was one of the few they had together, back when things were simpler, before the distance between them had begun to stretch. Dean came in, and Lynn could see the question already forming in his eyes. He never had to ask it. She could already hear herself saying, "I'm not leaving. I'm just standing still for a while." It was the only truth she could find. The letter from Riley arrived on a day that felt too much like every other. The kind of day where nothing seems to matter until something shifts. It was brief, almost too impersonal for the weight it carried. "I'm working in a different part of the country now," it said, with a simple signature beneath. There was nothing else. No apology, no explanation. Just the quiet finality of someone, choosing distance over words. Lynn sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter like it was a map she couldn't read. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper, feeling the coldness of it. Outside, the world continued on, unaffected by her. Small, quiet loss. Dean was at work, as usual, and she knew he wouldn't ask about the letter. Not really. As she sat by the window, watching a bus drive by, she thought about the person she used to be, the one who believed in possibility, in something beyond the confines of this house, this life. She whispered to herself, more out of habit than hope. Sometimes all you can do is let people find their own way. She looked at her reflection in the bus window as it passed, not quite recognizing the woman staring back. This isn't the end, she thought. Though she wasn't sure anymore. What was left to begin?